I'm just thinking about what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about logic, and I'm thinking about knowledge and philosophy, I suppose. Philosophy and science, actually, and particularly about how these things are argued. I suppose I'm coming to this because I've been watching a few YouTube videos about philosophy and science, and particularly I listened to a radio show which I got on my iPod, which I only managed to listen to last week, which is an old Radio 4 show called The Infinite Monkey Cage, which is a talk show but yeah, on this particular show was Raymond Tallis, the philosopher, Brian Cox, the scientist, some mathematician guy, Alexis Sale, comedian, one or two other folk, but it was quite good, and they were basically arguing the toss about philosophy and science, really in the wake of Stephen Hawking's comment in that book, Grand Design of his, that philosophy was effectively dead. And Brian Cox seemed to be, who's the scientist of course, seemed to be of that mind that it was a good idea before the scientific revolution in 17th century, 16th, 17th century, but now really we know how to gain knowledge. We don't need the philosophy thing anymore. Whereas people like Raymond Tallis, and to a certain extent the mathematician, which was interesting, were coming out and saying, well actually no, we need philosophy more than ever now. Actually the mathematician made a really interesting point at the end of it, saying that philosophy and mathematics were very close together, and since science draws on mathematics enormously, it kind of can't really abandon philosophy, even like it feel like it might want to. Anyway, what I'm thinking about here is to do with this philosophy thing, because in particularly how it's spoken on science and how it's spoken about. Because when science talks about itself, and particularly when it addresses the general public, but not exclusively that, it talks in allegorical language. That's inevitably part of it. And people like Richard Dawkins, popularisers of science, do that a lot, and they do it very well. Dawkins has got these books, the Blind Watchmaker, Selfish Gene, Mount Improbable, River Out of Eden. These are great potent metaphors, great potent allegories, but they are just that, they are allegories. They are, as I say, metaphorical uses of highly figurative language which construct these images from which make it easier to understand. But underpinning those, of course, are the theories. Without the theory of evolution by natural selection, you need that underneath it to get to the River Out of Eden or the Blind Watchmaker. And underpinning that, you need the data, you need the fossil record, you need the genome, you need an understanding of how these, you need the data, the raw materials to work with. And so when Dawkins is using these stories, he's aware of these underpinnings that really you absolutely need. And when you argue these things, when you argue biology in that case, you don't argue at the level of the analogy. You don't argue exactly what the scree layer is like on Mount Improbable, and you don't argue about the turbulence in the River Out of Eden, or exactly how selfish the gene is and what we can do about it, and whether it should go and stand in the corner. We don't argue about the glaucoma that caused the watchmaker's blindness. That would be ludicrous, of course. No, because those are just the as I say, the allegories which are used to help the communication, to engage with understandings. You can't even get it at the level of the theory. You might be able to. It's quite hard to construct new theories. You have to go to the data if you want to argue it. You have to go to the data, the fossil record or something like it, or the genome, or the raw data of from which, in that case, evolution by natural selection is constructed, and see what else you can do with that, or find new data, rearrange the new data into new theories, and then maybe think about new allegorical forms for how to communicate them. You can't do it from the top down. You have to start from the data, build that up into structures of information, and then convey that to other people to allow it to become knowledge through mechanisms of understanding. And those mechanisms of understanding are things like allegories, but you can't argue at the level of that. You have to argue with the data. Anyhow, yeah, philosophy isn't quite as bound up by that, although it does still have to do part of that sort of stuff. It does have to keep dipping down to the data and the theories, particularly in terms of how we're constructing those things, because the more recent histories of philosophy, I mean philosophy for quite a long time, certainly since before Descartes, since before Newton, has been concerned with what knowledge is. How can we know things? Has been a key philosophical theme. Even when there was no science, when it was just natural philosophy. Yes, you would try to find out about the world. Aristotle tries to find out about the world, gets some of it right, some of it wrong, but he's also concerned with how can we know things? How can we be sure that what we know is right? How can we be sure we're not being fooled? So philosophy has a lot of that history. And the 20th century has really picked up on that and ran with, how can we know what we know? How can we be sure what we know is right? How can we test that without just recourse to obviousness? And the other thing, of course, is language. The linguistic turn, I think it's probably referred to. I've heard that phrase. But certainly since Wittgenstein, you can't just assume that language is transparent, which it was for a long time. Bertrand Russell said that about Wittgenstein. He said that when he was, because Wittgenstein was Bertrand Russell's pupil at Oxford or Cambridge or somewhere, and Bertrand Russell had said that when he was working early part of the 20th century, he'd kind of acted as if language was just transparent. There was the facts, and you expressed those facts clearly, and that's all you needed to do as a philosopher. But he says, really partly influenced by Wittgenstein, but others who've taken on the role that language plays, language and thought, the relationship between language and thought and expression and knowledge, that since that, you realise you can't do that, Bertrand Russell said. And the same is true now, when we're doing contemporary philosophy now. We have to be aware of the fact that we're not just picking up pieces of data from the world and organising them in the way that seems obvious. Those very processes by which things seem obvious is itself the subject of philosophy, and of course the subject of scientific disciplines too. They're all working together, But how we understand, how we express what we understand, how we express what we understand to ourselves to make us feel like we know things, and to other people so that they know things, the kind of metaphors and figurations and analogies we use to convey that, and how we convince ourselves and others about those things through the use of metaphor, analogy, that kind of stuff, like River Out of Eden, Blind Watchmaker, Mount Improbable, Selfish Gene. All that stuff is the stuff of philosophy, and you kind of have to, it seems to me, to take those things on. Oops, Phoebe's rolling in something smelly. You kind of have to take those things on, You can't just take them at face value. If you're going to do the philosophy thing, you have to work in the light of that stuff, otherwise you're not doing philosophy, you're doing something else. And if you're not going back to the data and arguing from the data, you're not doing science either. You're just clashing metaphors, and you're playing party games with metaphor and analogy and stories, really. It's like a competing of myths. It's like religions competing, because that's how... No, I'm not doing religion a justice here, but a simplistic way of looking at religions and the competing civilizations that are sometimes held up as problems to the world is a cartoon version of that. Is one myth, one set of stories, one set of metaphors and analogies coming into conflict with another set of different stories without actually looking at the information, certainly not looking at any kind of data. Also not recognising the philosophical underpinnings of the mechanisms by which you are understanding and talking about the thing that you're wanting to talk about. A lot of traffic noise today up here. And there's the power station. Electric Zen power station.